Welcome to Café Stories. I'm Alfie, your host for today's mystery. I'd love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Today's mystery, The Legend of the Judas Tree, a new Hercule Poirot adventure where a philanthropist is found hanging from an ancient tree with a silver coin in his throat. Grab a coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. Hercule Poirot and the Legend of the Judas Tree. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Suffolk. It was in the late spring of 1934 that I found myself once again in England, having returned from my ranch in Argentina for what I had intended to be a brief visit. The weather was unseasonably warm, with the kind of heavy, oppressive air that promises a thunderstorm before nightfall. The London streets seemed to shimmer with heat, and even the most energetic pedestrians moved with a certain lethargy. I had been in London scarcely a week when I received a telegram from my old friend, Hercule Poirot. Hastings, join me Suffolk weekend. Interesting botanical specimen. Bring tweeds. Poirot. I confess I was both intrigued and somewhat amused. Poirot's interest in flora had never struck me as particularly pronounced, and the mention of botanical specimens seemed oddly out of character for my fastidious friend. Nevertheless, I found myself the following afternoon on a train bound for Suffolk, watching the pleasant countryside roll past my window as I pondered what could possibly have drawn Poirot away from his comfortable London flat. The station at Little Thornfield was a small, rural affair with only a single porter who appeared to be dozing in the afternoon heat. I was preparing to seek transportation to my destination when I spotted a gleaming Rolls-Royce waiting nearby, its chauffeur standing at attention. "Captain Hastings?" he inquired politely. Upon my confirmation, he added, "Mr. Montague sent me to collect you and Mr. Poirot. The Belgian gentleman arrived earlier this morning." The drive to Thornfield Hall was pleasant enough, though the gathering clouds on the horizon suggested the weather would soon turn. The chauffeur, a taciturn fellow named Briggs, offered little conversation beyond informing me that Sir Richard Montague was hosting several guests for the weekend. "A regular occurrence, is it?" I inquired, attempting to draw him out. "No, sir. First time in many years. Sir Richard's not one for society these days. Keeps to himself mostly except for his charitable work," replied Briggs, his eyes never leaving the road. "Bit odd, this gathering, if you ask me." "Odd? In what way?" "Just unusual characters, sir. The nun, for instance, and that botanist lady poking about the grounds for weeks now." We passed through impressive wrought-iron gates and proceeded up a long gravel drive lined with ancient oaks. Thornfield Hall itself was an imposing Jacobean mansion built of weathered red brick with numerous gables and tall chimneys. It had an air of faded grandeur about it, suggesting a family whose fortunes, while still substantial, had perhaps seen better days. As the car rounded the final bend, I was struck by an unusual sight. To one side of the expansive lawn stood a massive tree unlike any I had seen before. It towered over the landscape, its thick trunk gnarled and twisted, its branches spreading outward like great arms, ready to embrace, or perhaps to strangle. Even in the gathering gloom, there was something distinctly sinister about its appearance. "Impressive specimen, isn't it?" remarked Briggs, noting my interest. "That's the Judas tree, sir. Been here longer than the house, they say." "A Judas tree? I don't believe I'm familiar with the species." "Neither was I until I came to work here. Foreign tree it is. Sir Richard's great-grandfather brought it back from his travels. The botanist lady's been studying it for weeks now. Something about its sap being poisonous, I heard." We pulled up to the entrance, where a butler awaited. As I alighted, the first distant rumble of thunder could be heard across the fields. The butler, introducing himself as Perkins, led me into a spacious entrance hall adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and hunting trophies. Mr. Poirot is in the library with Sir Richard and the other guests, sir, if you'll follow me. I trust Poirot is comfortable? I asked as we walked. Oh, quite, sir, replied Perkins with the faintest suggestion of a smile. We've ensured his room has all the modern conveniences he requires. Sir Richard was most specific about the arrangements. As we proceeded down a corridor, I heard the familiar voice of my friend, punctuated by his distinctive laugh. Perkins opened a heavy oak door, and there was Poirot, immaculate as always in a perfectly tailored suit, his moustache waxed to impeccable points. "Ah, mon ami Hastings!" he exclaimed, rising to greet me. "You have arrived at last. Come, you must meet our host and his fascinating guests." Sir Richard Montague was a tall, spare man in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes. He greeted me cordially, if somewhat distractedly, before introducing the others. My ward, James Harrington, he indicated a handsome young man of about 30, with a lazy smile and carefully casual demeanour. Delighted, said Harrington, without appearing particularly so. He had the confident air of a man accustomed to wealth, though his eyes were watchful. Dr. Eleanor Vaughan, our botanist, Sir Richard continued, gesturing toward a serious-looking woman with intelligent eyes and prematurely grey hair pinned severely back. Captain Hastings, she acknowledged with a brief nod. Mr. Poirot has mentioned you. I understand you have an interest in native Argentinian flora. I'm afraid Poirot exaggerates my expertise, I admitted, wondering what else my friend had been saying about me. Sister Mary Agnes, who is doing remarkable work with our charitable foundation. The nun, perhaps in her 40s, had a serene face and quiet dignity, though I noticed a certain sharpness in her gaze as she assessed me. "A pleasure, Captain," she said softly. "Any friend of Mr. Poirot's is welcome here." And finally, my physician, Dr. Maxwell. The doctor was a ruddy-faced, jovial sort with a firm handshake and friendly manner. "Good to have another sensible Englishman about the place," he said, with a wink. Poirot, who had been observing these introductions with his characteristic attention to detail, now stepped forward. "Hastings, Sir Richard has most generously invited us to stay for the weekend. He has a most interesting botanical specimen on his estate, the magnificent tree you undoubtedly observed upon your arrival." "Yes, the chauffeur called it a Judas tree," I replied. A curious silence fell over the room. Sir Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, while Sister Mary Agnes's fingers moved briefly to the crucifix at her neck. "Indeed," said Dr. Vaughan, breaking the silence. "Chercis siliquastrum, to give it its proper name, a fascinating species and quite rare in England, especially one of such age and size." "It has been in the Montague family for generations," said Sir Richard, his voice carrying a note of pride. "Though some would say it has brought us more than its share of trouble." "Superstitious nonsense," muttered James Harrington, helping himself to a drink from the sideboard. "Perhaps," Sir Richard replied with a glance at his ward, "but even nonsense may contain a grain of truth, wouldn't you agree, Mr. Poirot?" "Indeed, monsieur," said Poirot thoughtfully. "In my experience, behind many superstitions lies a history worth investigating. I look forward to hearing more about your remarkable tree." Outside, the thunder rumbled closer, and the first heavy drops of rain began to spatter against the library windows. The approaching storm seemed to cast a shadow over the room, and I could not help but feel that beneath the polite conversation lay currents of tension and unspoken secrets. Little did I know then how prophetic the gathering clouds would prove to be, or what dark tragedy awaited us beneath the branches of the Judas tree. Chapter 2. The Legend of the Judas Tree. Dinner that evening was served in the grand dining room of Thornfield Hall. The table, polished to a gleaming finish, was set with heavy silver and fine china that spoke of generations of wealth. Outside, the storm had intensified, with rain lashing against the windows and occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the darkened grounds. Poirot, seated at Sir Richard's right hand, appeared entirely at ease, though I noticed his eyes darting occasionally to each face around the table with that peculiar attentiveness that I had come to recognize as the prelude to his interest being aroused. "Tell me, Dr. Vaughan," said Poirot, delicately patting his lips with his napkin, "what is it about this particular specimen of the Judas tree that has captured your scientific interest?" Dr. Vaughan's face brightened with scholarly enthusiasm. "It's quite extraordinary, Mr. Poirot. Most Cerci siliquastrum specimens in England are relatively young and struggle in our climate, but this one—" She gestured toward the window, beyond which the tree stood in darkness, "has thrived for nearly 2 centuries. Its size alone makes it botanically significant." "And its toxicity?" Poirot inquired. "I understand the sap contains certain interesting properties." "Indeed," she replied, leaning forward slightly. "The sap contains compounds similar to those found in certain toxic mushrooms, cyclopeptides that can cause liver damage if ingested, not immediately fatal, but potentially lethal over time. I'm studying whether the concentration in this particular specimen might be affected by its abnormal age and growth conditions." James Harrington gave a short laugh. "Always the poison with you scientists, isn't it? One might wonder about your intentions, Doctor." Dr. Vaughan stiffened. "My research is purely academic, Mr. Harrington." Of course," he replied with a dismissive wave, "just as my guardian's interest in the tree is purely sentimental." Sir Richard's face darkened momentarily. "The tree has been in my family for generations, James. It is more than mere sentiment." "Oh?" I inquired, sensing an opportunity to learn more. "Is there a particular history attached to it?" Sister Mary Agnes, who had been silent throughout most of the meal, set down her water glass with unexpected force. The small sound seemed magnified in the momentary lull of conversation. "I apologize," she said softly, not meeting anyone's eyes. "The storm has made me nervous." "Not at all, sister," said Sir Richard kindly. "In fact, the tree does have a rather dramatic history which might explain your discomfort. Local superstition has long held that the Judas tree serves as a sort of moral arbiter." "How fascinating," said Poirot, his eyes brightening. "Please, continue, monsieur." Sir Richard leaned back in his chair. "According to family legend, my great-grandfather brought the sapling back from his travels in the Mediterranean. The local name for it translated roughly as the traitor's tree, or judgment tree. It was said that those who betrayed their loved ones would meet their end beneath its branches." "Charming," murmured James with undisguised sarcasm. "There have been several incidents over the years," Sir Richard continued, ignoring his ward's comment. "In the late 1800s, a steward who had been embezzling funds was found hanging from one of its branches. Some 20 years later, a distant cousin who had swindled his business partner suffered the same fate." "Suicides, surely," said Dr. Maxwell, helping himself to more wine, people choosing a dramatic end to match their crimes. "Perhaps," said Sir Richard, "but in both cases there were unusual circumstances. The steward's pockets were found filled with the very coins he had stolen. The cousin had a business contract stuffed into his mouth. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Sister Mary Agnes visibly flinched. "You see," said Sir Richard, with a gentle smile. "Even Sister Mary Agnes feels the power of the story." "I find all such talk of judgment and vengeance rather disturbing," she replied in a measured tone. "God alone passes final judgment, Sir Richard." "Yet sometimes," said Poirot thoughtfully, "the instrument of divine justice may take a more tangible form, yes?" The nun's eyes met his for a moment, then dropped to her plate. "I couldn't say, Mr. Poirot." "Well, I think it's all ridiculous," declared James Harrington. "Trees don't judge people. People judge people, and usually quite harshly." He directed a pointed look at Sir Richard. "Speaking of judgment," Sir Richard said, seemingly unperturbed by his ward's attitude, "I've asked you all here this weekend because I have an important announcement to make tomorrow, something that will affect the future of the Montague Charitable Trust, and indirectly each of you." This pronouncement was met with varying reactions: curiosity from Dr. Vaughan, alert interest from Sister Mary Agnes, and a tightening of the lips from James Harrington. "May we inquire as to the nature of this announcement, Sir Richard?" asked Poirot. "All in good time, Mr. Poirot. Tomorrow after breakfast, I think. I have some documents to finalize tonight." The conversation turned to more general topics as the meal progressed, but I could not help noticing a new tension in the air. James drank more heavily than before, while Sister Mary Agnes seemed lost in thought, her food largely untouched. Dr. Vaughan kept glancing at Sir Richard with an expression I could not quite decipher, and Dr. Maxwell maintained a jovial facade that nonetheless seemed somewhat forced. After dinner, the party retired to the drawing-room. I found myself standing near a window, with Poirot, watching the rain streak down the glass. "What do you make of our host's mysterious announcement, Poirot?" I asked quietly. "It has caused a certain disturbance in the equilibrium, has it not?" he replied, carefully adjusting his bow tie in the reflection of the window. "Observe how young Mr. Harrington paces like the caged lion. And the good sister, she fingers her rosary beads, yet appears to say no prayers." "Do you think Sir Richard's announcement concerns his will?" I ventured. "Perhaps, mon ami. Or perhaps something of even greater significance." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he watched the reflection of the room behind us. "The doctor, he studies Sir Richard most carefully, you notice? And Dr. Vaughan, she has taken 3 trips to examine the bookshelves, yet has selected no book." Thunder crashed again, closer this time, and the lights flickered momentarily. Through the rain-streaked glass I caught a glimpse of the Judas tree, illuminated briefly by lightning, its twisted branches seeming to writhe against the stormy sky like the arms of a tormented soul. "A most unusual tree, is it not, Hastings?" murmured Poirot. "One feels almost that it watches the house, waiting." The Greeks, they had a word, nemesis, the spirit of divine retribution against those who show hubris. Perhaps this tree, it is the nemesis of the Montague family. I shivered involuntarily, though the room was warm. At that moment I could not have explained why Poirot's fanciful words disturbed me so, nor why the silhouette of that ancient tree filled me with such unease. It was only later, in the awful light of subsequent events, that I would recall his words and wonder if, in his peculiar way, my friend had sensed the tragedy that awaited us with the coming dawn. Chapter 3. A Body Among the Branches. I was awakened in the early hours of the morning by a tremendous crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of Thornfield Hall. For a moment I lay disoriented in the unfamiliar bedroom, listening to the fury of the storm outside. The rain lashed against the windows with almost vindictive force, and flashes of lightning illuminated the room in brief, ghostly tableau. Sleep proving impossible, I rose and donned my dressing gown. Perhaps a book from the library might help pass the time until the storm abated. As I opened my door, I was surprised to find the corridor already illuminated, with sounds of movement and hushed voices coming from the direction of the main staircase. Curious, I made my way toward the commotion. I encountered Perkins, the butler, in the upper hall, his normally impassive face betraying distinct alarm. "What's happening, Perkins?" I inquired. "It's Sir Richard, sir," he replied, his voice taut with concern. "He's not in his room, and his bed hasn't been slept in. Mr. James has organized a search of the house." In this weather? I glanced toward a window where the storm continued unabated. "Mr. James is most concerned, sir. Sir Richard often works late in his study, but he always retires by midnight. The study was found empty, with papers scattered across the desk." I quickly volunteered to join the search and returned to my room to dress. As I was pulling on my boots, there came a sharp rap at my door. It was Poirot, already impeccably dressed despite the hour, not a hair out of place. "Ah, Hastings, you have heard the news, yes?" His eyes, normally so bright and curious, held an unusual gravity. "About Sir Richard's disappearance? Yes, I was just preparing to join the search." "Then we shall go together, mon ami. I fear—" He stopped abruptly as a commotion erupted from downstairs. We hurried to investigate and found James Harrington giving instructions to several servants in the entrance hall. "We'll need lanterns," he was saying, his earlier languor replaced by tense efficiency. "And mackintoshes for anyone searching the grounds." "Mr. Harrington," called Poirot, "may I inquire as to what has been discovered thus far?" James turned to us, his face pale in the electric light. "Nothing yet, Mr. Poirot. My guardian sometimes walks the grounds at night when he can't sleep, but in this weather—" He left the implication hanging ominously. Dr. Maxwell appeared from the direction of the library, medical bag in hand. "Any news?" he asked brusquely. "We're organizing search parties now," James replied. "Dr. Vaughan is checking the outbuildings and Sister Mary Agnes is searching the east wing." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and for a moment the lights flickered ominously. In that instant a figure appeared in the doorway. Dr. Vaughan, drenched to the skin, her face a mask of shock. "The Judas tree," she gasped, water dripping from her sodden clothing onto the polished floor. "You must come quickly." The journey across the storm-lashed grounds remains in my memory as a nightmare tableau of driving rain, treacherous footing, and the desperate bobbing of lantern light. James led the way with Dr. Maxwell, Poirot, and myself following close behind. Dr. Vaughan had remained at the house to change her wet clothes and inform Sister Mary Agnes of the development. As we approached the massive silhouette of the Judas tree, another flash of lightning revealed the grotesque scene. A figure hung from one of the lower branches, twisting slightly in the wind, the sodden clothing plastered against the body. "Good God!" whispered James, the lantern in his hand wavering. Dr. Maxwell pushed forward, his professional instincts taking over. "Get him down quickly," he commanded, setting his bag on the wet ground and opening it. With some difficulty, James and I managed to lift the body high enough to release the tension on the rope, while Maxwell cut through the thick cord with a pocket knife. We lowered the body gently to the ground, but even before Maxwell bent to examine him, I knew Sir Richard Montague was beyond help. His face, illuminated by the uncertain light of the lantern, was discoloured and contorted, the eyes bulging horribly. "He's been dead for several hours," confirmed Maxwell, his fingers on the victim's wrist, "probably since shortly after we all retired." Poirot, who had been examining the scene with methodical care, suddenly knelt beside the body. "What is this?" he murmured, gently probing at Sir Richard's mouth with a handkerchief-covered finger. With delicate precision, he extracted a small, round object. Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination, I saw a silver coin resting on Poirot's handkerchief. "What in God's name?" exclaimed James, staring at the coin in disbelief. "It appears, monsieur," said Poirot gravely, that someone wished to make a point most dramatically. Maxwell leaned closer to examine the coin. It looks old, ancient even. Indeed, replied Poirot. And most symbolic, is it not? A silver piece placed in the mouth of a man hanged from the Judas tree. The implication hung in the air between us, as palpable as the storm that continued to rage overhead. The tree itself seemed to loom larger now, its gnarled branches reaching toward us like accusing fingers. "We should get him back to the house," said Maxwell, breaking the horrified silence. "Nothing more can be done here." As we prepared to carry the body back to Thornfield Hall, Poirot continued his examination of the scene, moving methodically around the base of the tree. The rain had begun to slacken somewhat, allowing him to search the ground more effectively. "Hastings," he called suddenly, "your assistance, if you please." I joined him at the far side of the massive trunk. He pointed to a small object half buried in the mud at the base of the tree. "If you would be so kind." I retrieved what appeared to be a torn piece of dark fabric, sodden with rain and stained with mud. "Keep it safe, mon ami," said Poirot quietly, "and observe the hands of our unfortunate victim before they move him." I looked as directed and noticed peculiar markings on Sir Richard's palms, dark stains that might have been sap or some other substance. Before I could examine them more closely, James and Dr. Maxwell had prepared to transport the body. Our sombre procession made its way back to the house, the body of Sir Richard Montague carried between us. The storm was beginning to recede, the thunder now a distant rumble, as though nature's fury had been appeased by the night's tragic events. Behind us, the Judas tree stood sentinel in the grey half-light of approaching dawn, its ancient branches still heavy with rain, and now with something more. The weight of another death added to its sinister legacy. Chapter 4. The Silver Piece. By mid-morning, Thornfield Hall had taken on the atmosphere of a besieged fortress. The local police had arrived shortly after dawn, led by Inspector Graves, a tall, austere man with a methodical manner that reminded me somewhat of our own Inspector Japp. The household staff moved about their duties with hushed voices and downcast eyes, while the guests remained sequestered in the drawing-room at the inspector's request. "I don't see why we're being treated as suspects," complained James Harrington, pacing restlessly near the fireplace. "It's clearly suicide. My guardian was under considerable strain recently." Dr. Maxwell, seated in an armchair with a cup of untouched tea before him, shook his head. "I've treated Sir Richard for years. He wasn't suicidal, despite his occasional melancholy. Besides," added Dr. Vaughan, who had exchanged her sodden clothes for a severe grey dress, "how do you explain the silver coin?" Sister Mary Agnes, who had been silently fingering her rosary beads, looked up sharply. "What silver coin?" Before anyone could respond, the drawing-room door opened to admit Inspector Graves and Poirot. They made an incongruous pair, the tall, sombre Englishman and the dapper Belgian with his waxed moustache and precise gestures. "Ladies and gentlemen," began Graves, "I appreciate your patience. We'll need to speak with each of you individually, but first, Mr. Poirot has something to share." Poirot stepped forward, holding a small object wrapped in his immaculate handkerchief. With a flourish that seemed incongruous given the circumstances, he unveiled the silver coin we had discovered in Sir Richard's mouth. "This," he announced, "is what is commonly known as a Judas piece." "A what?" asked James, stepping closer to examine it. "A replica of the 30 pieces of silver paid to Judas Iscariot for his betrayal," explained Poirot. "This particular specimen appears to be a 19th-century reproduction, not an actual ancient coin." I noticed Sister Mary Agnes grow pale, her fingers tightening around her rosary. "Are you suggesting this has religious significance?" inquired Dr. Vaughan, leaning forward with scholarly interest. "Perhaps," replied Poirot non-committally. "Or perhaps it references the name of the tree itself. The Judas tree, Quercus silicastrum, is so called because, according to legend, it is the type of tree from which Judas Iscariot hanged himself after his betrayal." A heavy silence followed this pronouncement, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. "So you're implying murder," said James flatly, "with some sort of biblical symbolism attached?" "That is one possibility we must consider," replied Graves, his tone neutral. "Mr. Harrington, perhaps we could begin with you? If you'd accompany me to the library." After James and the inspector departed, Poirot turned to me. "Hastings, perhaps you would be so good as to show me Sir Richard's study? I understand it was found in some disarray." The study, located in the east wing, was indeed in a state of disorder unusual for a man reputed to be as methodical as Sir Richard. Papers lay scattered across the desk, a chair was overturned, and a glass had been knocked onto the carpet, leaving a dark stain. "Signs of a struggle, Poirot?" I suggested. "Perhaps, mon ami, or perhaps the staging of one." Poirot moved about the room with delicate precision, occasionally stooping to examine something more closely. "Observe the papers on the desk. They appear disordered, yet they remain largely on the desk surface. In a genuine struggle, would they not be more widely dispersed?" He carefully examined the contents of the desk drawers, then moved to a small wall safe that stood open and empty. "Most curious," he murmured. "Sir Richard was preparing to change his will, I believe." "How do you know that?" I asked, surprised. Poirot indicated several papers on the desk. "These are notes for his solicitor. See here, amendments to the Montague Trust, new provisions. But the actual will, it is missing." He continued his methodical examination, pausing before a collection of framed photographs on the mantelpiece. One in particular seemed to capture his attention, a faded image of a young woman standing beneath the Judas tree, which appeared considerably smaller and younger in the photograph. "Late 19th century, I would estimate," said Poirot, studying the image. "Observe the fashion of the dress and see how the young lady's hand rests upon the tree trunk. Almost a gesture of possession, is it not?" Before I could comment, we were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Vaughan. "Excuse me," she said, seeming slightly flustered to find us there. "I needed to collect my research notes. Sir Richard had been reviewing them." "By all means, Doctor," said Poirot graciously, stepping aside. "Your work on the Judas tree's toxicity, it has been productive." "Quite," she replied, retrieving a leather-bound notebook from among the papers on the desk. "Though I haven't finished my analysis of the SAP samples." She hesitated, then added, "That's partly what makes this so strange." Sir Richard had recently become intensely interested in my findings. "Indeed?" Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what exactly was the nature of his interest?" Dr. Vaughan glanced down at her notebook. "He wanted to know specifically about the effects of long-term, low-dose exposure to the tree's toxins. He mentioned something about historical accounts of illness in the household staff who worked near the tree." "Most interesting," murmured Poirot. "And the sap samples you collected, they are where?" "In my room. I have a small field laboratory set up there. With your permission, I should like to examine them later." After Dr. Vaughan departed with her notebook, Poirot continued his investigation of the study. He paid particular attention to a leather blotter on the desk, holding it at an angle to the light. "Hastings, your penknife, if you please." I handed him my pocket-knife, and with surgical precision He carefully scraped at the edge of the blotter, collecting a few granules of a dark, resinous substance in a small envelope he produced from his waistcoat pocket. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" I asked. "It is too early for conclusions, mon ami, but observe—" He pointed to the window, which offered a clear view of the Judas tree in the distance. From here, Sir Richard could contemplate the tree at his leisure. One wonders what thoughts it inspired. Later that morning, I encountered James Harrington emerging from his interview with Inspector Graves. His face was flushed with anger, and he brushed past me without acknowledgement, making directly for the decanter of whisky on the sideboard in the drawing-room. "The inspector seems to think I murdered my guardian for his money," he said bitterly, pouring himself a generous measure, "as if I hadn't been perfectly content with my allowance and expectations all these years." "What makes him suspect you particularly?" I inquired, accepting the drink he grudgingly offered me. James gave a humourless laugh. "Apparently Sir Richard was planning to change his will. The inspector seems to think I discovered this and acted to prevent it." He downed his drink in one swallow. "What he doesn't understand is that I already knew about the changes. Richard told me himself last week." "And these changes would have affected you adversely?" A shadow crossed James's face. "That's the irony. He was increasing my share, not reducing it, though with additional stipulations." He poured himself another drink, his hand not entirely steady. "But try telling that to a police inspector who's already decided you're guilty." As I left James to his brooding, I passed Sister Mary Agnes in the corridor, her head bowed in what appeared to be prayer. She looked up as I approached, and I was struck by the intensity in her eyes, not grief exactly, but something deeper and more complex. "A terrible business, isn't it?" I offered sympathetically. "Justice takes many forms, Captain Hastings," she replied quietly. "Sometimes it arrives unexpectedly." With that cryptic remark she continued on her way, leaving me to wonder at her meaning. Outside, the Judas tree stood stark against the clearing sky, its branches no longer dripping with rain, but still bearing the invisible weight of Sir Richard's death, and perhaps other secrets yet to be revealed. Chapter 5. Secrets Beneath the Root. The following day dawned bright and clear, as though the storm had washed away all evidence of the previous night's tragedy. Inspector Graves had established himself in the library, conducting interviews with the household staff, while the rest of us were left to our own devices, though with strict instructions not to leave the premises. Shortly after breakfast, Poirot approached me with an air of purpose. "Come, Hastings," he said, adjusting his hat to a precise angle. "We shall make a little expedition to the village." "Is that wise?" I asked, glancing toward the library where Inspector Graves was ensconced. The inspector seemed rather emphatic about no one leaving. Poirot's moustache twitched slightly. "I have informed the good inspector of our intentions. He understands that I may discover information of value." We set off in a small motor car that Poirot had somehow persuaded James Harrington to lend us. The countryside, freshly washed by the storm, gleamed in the morning sunlight, presenting a pastoral tranquillity that seemed at odds with the darkness that had descended upon Thornfield Hall. The village of Little Thornfield proved to be a picturesque collection of stone cottages clustered around a medieval church. Our first stop was the vicarage, where Poirot introduced himself to the Reverend Thomas Willoughby, an elderly man with a scholar's stoop and bright, inquisitive eyes. "Sir Richard Montague," the vicar repeated, after Poirot had explained our errand. "A tragic business, most tragic. He was a generous benefactor to the Church Restoration Fund." "You knew him well?" inquired Poirot. "As well as anyone, I suppose. The Montagues have been the local gentry for generations, though Sir Richard was more approachable than his predecessors." The vicar hesitated, then added, But I sense you're not here merely to discuss Sir Richard's character. Indeed not, mon père, replied Poirot. I am interested in the history of the Montague family, specifically any incidents that might be connected to the Judas tree on the estate. A subtle change came over the vicar's expression. Ah, that unfortunate tree. There have been rumours, of course, spanning back decades. What sort of rumours? I asked. The usual sort of country superstition, claims that the tree brings misfortune to the Montague family. There was a particularly unsavoury incident in the 1880s. Sir Richard's father, Sir William, was involved in a scandal involving a young woman from the village. A romantic entanglement, suggested Poirot. The vicar nodded gravely. A servant girl at the hall, she became with child. The story goes that Sir William denied any responsibility and dismissed her. She was found shortly afterward, drowned in the lake on the estate. Near the Judas tree? Asked Poirot sharply. Under its branches, in fact. The local people claimed the tree had judged Sir William, though of course he lived for many years afterward. The vicar paused, then added, The curious thing was that Sir William became something of a recluse after the incident, and was rarely seen beyond the hall grounds until his death. And the girl? I inquired. What became of her child? The poor creature was born posthumously, I believe. I'm not entirely certain what happened to the infant. Adopted by relatives in another village, perhaps. It was all rather hushed up at the time. Poirot's eyes had taken on the particular gleam that I knew betokened his interest. Would there be any record of this affair? Any parish registers, perhaps? You might check with Mrs. Baxter at the post office, the vicar suggested. Her grandmother was housekeeper at Thornfield Hall during that period. Village memories are long, Mr. Poirot, especially regarding the sins of the gentry. Mrs. Baxter proved to be a fountain of information. Once Poirot had charmed her with his foreign manners and exquisite courtesy. We sat in her neat parlour behind the post office, drinking tea from delicate china cups. Oh, the scandal was the talk of the village for years, she confided, her eyes bright with the pleasure of sharing long-preserved gossip. My grandmother said the poor girl, Eliza Barton was her name, was beautiful but naive. Sir William took advantage, as gentlemen often did in those days. And after her death, prompted Poirot. The baby was a girl, born to Eliza's sister Jane, who raised the child as her own. They left the area soon after. Too many wagging tongues, you understand. Went up north somewhere, Manchester or Liverpool. Do you know what became of them? Mrs. Baxter shook her head. Lost track after they left, though my grandmother always said Sir William sent money regular-like through his solicitor. Conscience money, she called it. One final question, madame, said Poirot. The Judas tree on the estate, it had some connection to this affair. A shadow seemed to cross Mrs. Baxter's face. Eliza was found beneath it. Some said she hanged herself from its branches before falling into the lake, but the coroner ruled it a simple drowning. After that, people began saying the tree would bring judgment on the Montagues some day. Superstitious nonsense, of course, she added hastily. But when Sir William's steward was found hanging from the same tree years later, well. We returned to Thornfield Hall in the early afternoon. Poirot unusually silent during the drive, his forehead furrowed in thought. As we approached the house, we observed Dr. Vaughan near the Judas tree, collecting samples from its trunk with scientific precision. "Still pursuing your research, Doctor?" called Poirot as we drew near. She straightened, looking momentarily startled. "Yes. Scientific inquiry doesn't stop for tragedy, Mr. Poirot. In fact, given recent events, my analysis of the tree's toxicity has taken on new urgency." "You suspect the sap might have played a role in Sir Richard's death?" I inquired. "I couldn't say definitively without further tests," she replied cautiously. But Sir Richard had been displaying certain symptoms consistent with cyclopeptide poisoning, digestive disturbances, occasional disorientation. Symptoms that Dr. Maxwell was treating, suggested Poirot. A guarded look came into her eyes. You'd have to ask Dr. Maxwell about that. Doctor-patient confidentiality, you understand? As we continued toward the house, we passed the small chapel where Sister Mary Agnes knelt in prayer, her head bowed, lips moving silently. She seemed oblivious to our presence, lost in her devotions. A most pious lady, observed Poirot quietly. Upon entering the house, we encountered James Harrington in the hall, concluding what appeared to be a heated telephone conversation. "I don't care what they're saying," he was saying tersely. "Keep them away from—" He broke off abruptly upon noticing us, his face flushing slightly. "I'll call you back," he said into the receiver before hanging up with more force than necessary. "Problems, Mr. Harrington?" inquired Poirot mildly. "Nothing I can't handle," he replied curtly. "Newspaper vultures trying to get the story, as if my guardian's death were public entertainment." After James had departed, Poirot made his way to Sir Richard's study, where he began a methodical examination of the desk drawers. His persistence was rewarded when he discovered a hidden compartment containing a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon. "Correspondence from the 1880s, he murmured, carefully examining the fragile paper. "Between Sir William and his solicitor. Most interesting." "What do they say?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. "They concern financial arrangements for the support of a child, and here—" He indicated a passage, a reference to making amends for the unfortunate incident. "The solicitor advises discretion in this delicate matter involving the Barton girl." "The servant who drowned," I said, the pieces beginning to connect. "Precisely, Hastings. And observe the date of the final letter, just 3 days before Sir William's death." Poirot carefully refolded the letters. "It appears that the past casts very long shadows at Thornfield Hall, mon ami. Shadows that may reach even to the present day." Outside the study window, the Judas tree stood in stark relief against the afternoon sky, its ancient branches spread wide like welcoming arms, or perhaps like the hands of an executioner poised to deliver judgment for sins long buried but not forgotten. Chapter 6. The Faded Photograph. Later that afternoon, Poirot gathered Inspector Graves, Dr. Maxwell, and myself in the library. The inspector had been making little headway with his investigation and seemed grateful for Poirot's assistance, though he maintained a professional skepticism. "Let us consider the timeline of events," began Poirot, pacing before the fireplace with precise steps. "Sir Richard retires to his study after dinner, approximately 9:30, according to the butler's testimony. The storm begins in earnest around 10 o'clock. At what time, Doctor, would you estimate Sir Richard's death occurred?" Dr. Maxwell stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Based on the body's condition, between 11 and midnight, certainly no later than 1 in the morning." "And when was the body discovered?" Poirot asked, turning to the inspector. "Dr. Vaughan found him at approximately 5:30 in the morning," replied Graves. "She had risen early to check on some experiment and noticed something amiss at the tree." "So," said Poirot, "we have a window of several hours during which the murder, or suicide, if you prefer, took place. Now let us consider the movements of each person in the house during this critical period." What followed was a meticulous reconstruction of the previous night's events. James Harrington claimed to have retired immediately after dinner, a fact corroborated by his valet. Dr. Vaughan had been in her room, working on her research notes until quite late. Dr. Maxwell had read in the drawing-room until around 11, then gone to bed. Sister Mary Agnes had been in the chapel, engaged in evening prayers, and later in her room. "The difficulty," observed Inspector Graves, is that anyone could have slipped out during the storm. The thunder would have masked any sounds of movement." "Precisely," agreed Poirot. "And there is the matter of the hanging itself. To suspend a grown man from that branch would require considerable strength, yes? Yet the rope shows evidence of a clever pulley system." "Meaning?" prompted the inspector. "Meaning, Inspector, that our killer may have used ingenuity rather than brute force. A person of modest physical strength could have accomplished it with the right preparation." I recalled the branch from which Sir Richard had been suspended, thick and sturdy, yet low enough that a person of average height could reach it with minimal difficulty. "There is also," continued Poirot, "the curious fact of Sir Richard's hands. They bore traces of the tree's sap, suggesting he had touched the trunk shortly before his death." "He could have been trying to save himself, grabbing at the tree while being hanged," suggested Graves. "Perhaps," said Poirot, though his tone suggested he thought otherwise. "And then there is the silver coin, a detail too symbolic to be coincidental." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Perkins, bearing a telegraph for Inspector Graves. The inspector read it with raised eyebrows. "Well, this is interesting," he said. "It seems Sister Mary Agnes's background checks out. She's been with the Sisters of Mercy for 18 years. Before that, she was raised in a Catholic orphanage in Manchester." "Manchester," I repeated, recalling Mrs. Baxter's mention of the Barton girl's sister taking her niece up north. Poirot's eyes met mine briefly, acknowledging the connection, but he made no comment. After the meeting dispersed, Poirot led me back to Sir Richard's study, where he resumed his examination of the dead man's possessions. "There is something here, Hastings," he murmured, rifling through a desk drawer. "Something that— Ah!" He withdrew a leather-bound photograph album, its pages yellowed with age. With careful fingers, he turned the brittle pages until he came to a particular image, the same faded photograph we had noticed earlier of the young woman standing beneath a much younger Judas tree. "Eliza Barton, I presume," I said, studying the pretty, solemn face of the girl in the outmoded dress. "Indeed," replied Poirot, "and observe, Hastings, this detail here." He pointed to the girl's ankle, visible beneath the hem of her dress. "Do you see it?" I peered closer. There appeared to be some sort of marking on her skin, a small dark pattern that I had initially taken for a shadow or a flaw in the photograph. "A tattoo?" I suggested. "I believe so. And the design, it resembles a leaf, does it not? Perhaps the leaf of the very tree beneath which she stands." Before I could respond, we were interrupted by Dr. Maxwell, who entered with an apologetic cough. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I was looking for some of Sir Richard's medical records. He kept copies in his desk." "Of course, Doctor," said Poirot, stepping aside, but not before carefully returning the photograph album to its place. "Tell me, if you would, about Sir Richard's health in recent months." Dr. Maxwell hesitated, then shrugged. "I suppose there's no harm in discussing it now. He had been experiencing digestive disturbances, occasional disorientation, insomnia. I'd attributed it to stress and advancing age, prescribed some mild sedatives. Could these symptoms be consistent with poisoning, perhaps from the sap of the Judas tree?" The doctor looked startled. "I suppose it's possible. I hadn't considered. But surely, how would he have been exposed?" "That, doctor, is the question," replied Poirot. "Now, if you'll excuse us." After Maxwell had gone, Poirot turned to me with an expression of deep concentration. "Hastings, I wish to examine Sister Mary Agnes's room." "Her room?" "But surely the inspector would never permit—" "The inspector need not know, mon ami. A brief inspection while the good sister is at her devotions in the chapel." I was uncomfortable with this clandestine approach, but Poirot was already moving with purpose toward the east wing where the guests' rooms were located. Sister Mary Agnes's chamber was austere, As one might expect from a nun, a narrow bed, a simple crucifix on the wall, a small desk with devotional books. Poirot moved swiftly and methodically, disturbing nothing but examining everything. On the bedside table lay a rosary of dark wooden beads which he studied with particular attention. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Observe the craftsmanship, Hastings. These beads are handmade, quite old. And the wood—" "From the Judas tree," I ventured, catching his train of thought. "It would appear so. The distinctive grain is similar to the sample Dr. Vaughan showed me." His examination complete, we slipped out as quietly as we had entered. In the corridor, Poirot paused, his expression thoughtful. "There is a pattern emerging, Hastings, but it requires one more piece to become clear." That evening, as dusk fell, I observed Sister Mary Agnes walking alone in the garden near the Judas tree. There was something in her posture, a tension, a watchfulness, that struck me as peculiar. When she believed herself unobserved, her serene demeanour seemed to slip, revealing a different woman beneath the habit. From my vantage point at the library window, I could see her circle the massive tree slowly, one hand trailing along its rough bark in what appeared almost a caress. Then, with a quick glance toward the house, she knelt at the base of the trunk, apparently searching for something among the gnarled roots. I reported this curious behaviour to Poirot later, who nodded as though it confirmed some private theory. "All becomes clearer, mon ami," he said. "Tomorrow, I think, we shall be ready to reveal the truth about Sir Richard's death, and about the long shadow cast by the Judas tree through generations of the Montague family." Outside, the ancient tree loomed against the darkening sky, its twisted silhouette a reminder of how the past reaches into the present, and how old sins, like the tree's deep roots, remain hidden but alive beneath the surface of respectable lives. Chapter 7. 30 Pieces of Silver. The morning brought news that Inspector Graves had requested an arrest warrant for James Harrington. Poirot received this information with raised eyebrows as we took breakfast together in the small morning room. "The inspector moves with haste, does he not?" he remarked, delicately spreading marmalade on his toast. "You don't think James is guilty?" I asked, surprised. "I think, mon ami, that the case against him is built on circumstance and supposition. Yes, he stood to inherit. Yes, there were tensions between him and his guardian. But murder—" Poirot shook his head. "There are too many elements that do not fit with Mr. Harrington's character or capabilities." "Such as?" "The symbolism, Hastings, the silver coin, the choice of the Judas tree, these speak of personal significance, of a crime with roots in the past. Mr. Harrington is too young to have such connections." Before I could pursue this line of thought further, Perkins entered to inform us that Inspector Graves wished to see Poirot urgently. We found the inspector in the library examining a collection of silver coins laid out on a blotter. "Ah, Mr. Poirot," he said, looking up from his examination, "I thought you might be interested in this. We've found a complete set of replica Judas coins in Sir Richard's collection. One is missing, presumably the one placed in his mouth." Poirot bent to study the coins. "Where were these discovered?" "In a display case in his bedroom. Apparently he was something of a collector of biblical artifacts." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Most interesting. And did anyone besides Sir Richard have access to this collection?" "That's just it," replied Graves. "According to the housekeeper, Sir Richard often showed these coins to guests. Any one of the household could have known about them and had opportunities to take one. Yet the choice of this particular coin as a murder token suggests intimate knowledge of its significance," mused Poirot. "Tell me, Inspector, have you completed your background check on Dr. Vaughan?" "Yes, she's legitimate. Respected botanist, published several papers on toxic plants, been working with the Royal Botanical Society for the past decade. And Dr. Maxwell? Long-standing family physician, known Sir Richard for 20 years. No red flags there. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. I should like to conduct a small experiment this afternoon, with your permission. Perhaps at 3 o'clock we might gather everyone near the Judas tree. What sort of experiment? Asked Graves, suspiciously. A reconstruction of sorts. I believe it will prove most illuminating. After some persuasion, the inspector agreed. When he had departed, Poirot turned to me with unusual gravity. Hastings, there is something I must verify before our gathering. I require your assistance with a delicate matter. Of course, Poirot. What do you need? A distraction, mon ami. I must examine something in Sister Mary Agnes's room once more, but I cannot risk being discovered. I was uncomfortable with the deception, but agreed to help. A short while later, I found myself engaged in a rather forced conversation with Sister Mary Agnes in the conservatory, asking her detailed questions about her charitable work while Poirot slipped upstairs. The orphanage in Manchester where you were raised, I ventured, recalling our earlier discoveries. It must have instilled in you a deep commitment to helping disadvantaged children. A shadow crossed her face briefly. Yes, Captain Hastings. When one has experienced hardship firsthand, one develops a certain sensitivity to the suffering of others. And how did you come to be involved with Sir Richard's foundation? Divine Providence, she replied, with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Our paths crossed at a charity function in London last year. When he learned of my background in administration, he invited me to assist with his foundation. A fortunate meeting, I remarked. Indeed, though I believe there are no accidents in God's plan, Captain. Her fingers moved to the wooden rosary at her waist. Each encounter serves his purpose. Our conversation was interrupted by the return of Poirot, who appeared in the doorway with an expression of satisfied determination. My friend had evidently found whatever he had been seeking. By 3 o'clock, dark clouds had once again gathered on the horizon, providing a dramatic backdrop for our assembly beneath the Judas tree. Inspector Graves had arranged for James Harrington to be present, though the young man stood apart from the others, his face tight with suppressed anger. Dr. Vaughan carried her notebook and several small glass vials, while Dr. Maxwell looked uncomfortable, repeatedly checking his pocket watch. Sister Mary Agnes stood with quiet dignity, her eyes occasionally straying to the massive trunk of the ancient tree. Ladies and gentlemen, began Poirot once everyone had gathered, I have asked you here because this tree is central to our investigation. It is not merely the scene of Sir Richard's death, but I believe it holds the key to understanding why he died. Lightning flickered in the distance, echoing the dramatic nature of Poirot's pronouncement. The approaching storm seemed to mirror the tension among our small group. Inspector Graves believes that Mr. Harrington is responsible for his guardian's death, continued Poirot. A conclusion based primarily on the assumption that Sir Richard intended to change his will to Mr. Harrington's detriment. Which is completely false, interjected James heatedly. Precisely, agreed Poirot. In fact, Sir Richard was indeed modifying his will, but not to disinherit his ward. Rather, he was making provisions for someone else, someone whose existence he had only recently discovered. A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Dr. Vaughan, Poirot turned suddenly to the botanist. Your analysis of the tree's sap, it confirmed the presence of toxic compounds, did it not? She nodded. Yes, cyclopeptides, similar to those found in certain poisonous mushrooms. Prolonged exposure could cause symptoms consistent with what Sir Richard had been experiencing. And you shared these findings with Sir Richard? Of course. He was funding my research. And his reaction? Pressed Poirot. Dr. Vaughan hesitated. He seemed troubled, asked many questions about how the toxin might be administered, whether it would be detectable. Because, said Poirot, he suspected he was being poisoned, not by the tree directly, but by someone using its toxic properties. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small vial. This is tea, specially blended for Sir Richard. It contains trace amounts of the Judas tree's sap, not enough to kill quickly, but sufficient to cause gradual deterioration. Dr. Maxwell stepped forward, his professional interest aroused. That would explain his symptoms, but who would have access to prepare his tea regularly? All eyes turned to the butler, Perkins, who stood nervously at the edge of the group. I serve his lordship's tea, sir, but I don't prepare it. That's done in the kitchen. Or perhaps, suggested Poirot, by someone else entirely. Someone with both knowledge of the tree's properties and a powerful motive. His gaze settled on Sister Mary Agnes, whose face remained impassive. Someone whose true identity Sir Richard had only recently discovered. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a rumble of thunder that seemed to emphasize Poirot's words. In that brief, harsh light, Sister Mary Agnes appeared transformed, the serene nun replaced by a woman of fierce determination. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Poirot," she said calmly, though her fingers tightened on her rosary. "I think you do," replied Poirot. He turned to Inspector Graves. "The woman before us is indeed Sister Mary Agnes of the Sisters of Mercy, but before she took her vows, she was known by another name, the daughter of Eliza Barton and Sir William Montague." As another flash of lightning cast dramatic shadows across the gathering, a sudden gust of wind caught Sister Mary Agnes's long skirt, momentarily lifting the hem to reveal her ankle, and there, clear against her pale skin, was a small tattoo in the distinctive shape of a Judas tree leaf. Chapter 8. Judgment Falls. For a moment after Poirot's revelation, silence reigned absolute. Even the storm seemed to pause, as though nature itself awaited the woman's response. Sister Mary Agnes stood motionless, her face partially shadowed by her habit, but I could see her fingers tighten around her rosary beads. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. Her voice altered, harder, with the faintest trace of a northern accent that had been absent before. "I suspected from our first meeting," replied Poirot. "There was something in your reaction when the Judas tree was mentioned, a personal connection that transcended mere religious symbolism. But certainty came only yesterday when I discovered this." He produced from his pocket a small silver locket. Sister Mary Agnes's hand moved involuntarily to her throat, as though reaching for something no longer there. "Where did you find that?" she demanded. "Among Sir Richard's most private possessions. Inside is a miniature portrait of a young woman, Eliza Barton, your mother, and a lock of dark hair. The inscription reads, 'Remembered always.' Sir Richard kept this, I think, out of a sense of family obligation. He knew who you were, did he not?" The nun's composure finally cracked, a bitter smile transforming her face. "Yes, he knew. I made sure of it when I came here." "Sister Mary Agnes," began Inspector Graves, stepping forward with an expression of confused determination. "My name," she interrupted, "is Mary Agnes Barton. I took my mother's surname when I left the orphanage before entering the convent. The Sisters of Mercy gave me sanctuary and purpose, but they did not know my true mission." "Which was?" prompted Graves. "Justice," she said simply. "Justice, long delayed." "Perhaps," suggested Poirot gently. you would share with us how this came to pass." Mary Agnes looked up at the twisted branches of the Judas tree now swaying in the strengthening wind. "My Aunt Jane raised me until I was 7, then she died of consumption. Her last act was to tell me the truth, that my father was not a deceased labourer, as I'd been told, but Sir William Montague, who had seduced and abandoned my mother. And your mother took her own life beneath this tree," added Poirot. "Not suicide, Mr. Poirot. Never that." Mary Agnes's voice rang with certainty. "My aunt was convinced my mother had been murdered, her body placed in the lake to suggest drowning. My mother was a devout woman. She would never have violated her faith by taking her own life, no matter her desperation. Yet you took religious vows yourself," I observed. "The perfect cover, Captain Hastings. Who would suspect a nun of harbouring thoughts of vengeance? And it gave me access to the great houses through charitable work. For years I searched for an opportunity to meet a Montague, to confront them with their family's crime." "And Sir Richard?" inquired Poirot. "He was not even born when your mother died. Why direct your vengeance against him?" "At first I meant only to make him acknowledge what his father had done," she admitted, "to force the truth into the open. But when I arrived here and saw how he lived, in wealth and comfort, the respected philanthropist, while my mother lay in an unmarked grave—" Her voice hardened. "And then I discovered he had known about me for years. His father had confessed everything on his deathbed, including his suspicions about my mother's death." "So you began poisoning him," said Dr. Maxwell, his professional indignation evident. "That's why his symptoms confounded me. Small doses of the tree's toxin administered regularly." "In his evening tea?" confirmed Mary Agnes. "I volunteered to prepare it each night. A special blend for his nerves," I said. "But slow poisoning wasn't enough," continued Poirot. "When Sir Richard informed you of his intention to amend his will, to acknowledge you as his half-brother's daughter and provide for you substantially—" "It was an insult!" Her calm demeanour shattered completely. "To think that money could compensate for what was done to my mother, for the life I was forced to live. He spoke of making amends, as though his family's sins could be wiped away with a banker's draft." "So you decided on a more dramatic form of justice," said Poirot, "one that would expose the family secret and serve as a warning to others." "The Judas tree has been executing judgment on the Montagues for generations," she replied, a strange light in her eyes. "I merely helped it fulfill its purpose." "By luring Sir Richard out during the storm," said Poirot, "persuading him to meet you at the tree to discuss his proposed amendment to his will. But instead of reconciliation, you had prepared a noose." Mary Agnes did not deny it. "He came willingly enough? I told him I had information about my mother that he should hear before finalizing his plans. The storm provided perfect cover. No one could hear him call for help." "The pulley system was ingeniously simple," observed Poirot. "And with Sir Richard already weakened by the poison, overpowering him would not have been difficult." "And the silver coin?" asked Inspector Graves. "Why place it in his mouth?" 30 pieces of silver, the price of betrayal," she answered. "My mother trusted Sir William, just as Judas once trusted his master. Both were betrayed, both died beneath the Judas tree. It seemed fitting." The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as Inspector Graves stepped forward, his face grave but compassionate. "Mary Agnes Barton, I must arrest you for the murder of Sir Richard Montague." She submitted without resistance, allowing him to take her arm. But as they prepared to return to the house, she paused, looking back at the ancient tree with an expression almost like tenderness. "My mother's spirit has waited a long time for this day. she said quietly. The circle is complete now. As they led her away, Dr. Vaughan approached Poirot with undisguised admiration. "How did you piece it together, Mr. Poirot? The connection between Sister Mary Agnes and Eliza Barton." "It began with the tattoo," replied Poirot. "In the old photograph, Eliza Barton had a distinctive mark on her ankle, a leaf from the Judas tree. A curious choice, suggesting a deep personal connection to the tree itself. When I glimpsed a similar marking on Sister Mary Agnes, the possibility presented itself. The Manchester orphanage confirmed it. Both women had roots in the same location." "But the final proof?" I inquired. "Came from Sir Richard's own papers, Hastings. He had been investigating his family history, corresponding with the orphanage where Mary Agnes was raised. He had discovered her true identity and was preparing to acknowledge her as his niece. Too late, alas, to prevent tragedy. As we returned to the house, a tremendous crack of lightning split the sky, striking the ancient Judas tree with an explosion of light and sound that made us all turn in alarm. The massive trunk, which had stood for nearly 2 centuries, split down the middle, its 2 halves crashing to the ground in a shower of splintered wood and torn foliage. "Mon Dieu," murmured Poirot, crossing himself instinctively. "It seems the tree's work is indeed finished." In the days that followed, as we prepared to depart Thornfield Hall, I found myself reflecting on the strange symmetry of the case. Mary Agnes Barton had been taken into custody, her confession simple and without remorse. James Harrington, exonerated of all suspicion, had immediately begun arrangements to sell the estate. "I could never live here now," he told us as we took our leave. "Too many shadows, too many secrets." On our journey back to London, Poirot sat silently for a long while, gazing out at the passing countryside. "What troubles you, Poirot?" I finally asked. "The case is solved. Justice will be served." "Justice, Hastings," he replied thoughtfully. "I wonder. The unfortunate Sir Richard paid the price for his father's sins. Mary Agnes Barton will pay the price for her vengeance. The cycle of retribution continues, does it not?" "You sound almost sympathetic to her," I observed with some surprise. "I cannot condone murder, mon ami, never that. But I understand the poison of hatred that can grow from seeds planted long ago. The roots of this crime extended deep into the past, just like those of the Judas tree itself." I thought of that ancient tree, now destroyed by lightning at the very moment justice had been served. Perhaps there was a certain cosmic symmetry to it all, a final closing of accounts that had remained unsettled for generations. As our train steamed toward London, leaving Suffolk and its secrets behind, I realized that of all Poirot's cases, this one had affected him most deeply. For in the end, the mystery of the Judas tree had revealed not just a murderer, but the long shadow that sin casts through time, and how even the most carefully buried secrets may one day rise to claim their judgment. Thanks for joining us for The Legend of the Judas Tree. Did you guess the killer before Poirot? If you liked this story, hit subscribe and share it with fellow mystery lovers. This is Alfie signing off from Café Stories.